Welcome back to U.S. Farm Report this weekend from Purdue University. All right, Todd, I teased it with the last roundtable, but when you look at cash rents, we have seen a rapid rise in cash rents across the country, but specifically looking at Indiana, record cash rents in places. Do you think that will continue?
It's really tricky to tell, right? So the challenge with cash rent, and I always argue it's one of the hardest numbers to sort of measure, right? Even though we used to work at the USDA in the area. The challenge is that it's based on a bargaining process between the landlord and tenant. And so we do have high commodity prices. Looks like we'll have pretty good production. Farmers will have some liquidity, but at the same time, they're seeing a lot of their input costs rise. And so farmers will be hesitant to sort of accept higher cash rental rates. But I know the landlords also, they're in an inflationary environment. They're going to want to see them up. So I think we'll probably hold relatively stable, not a big movement one way or the other. But I mean, we'll kind of see. It's how the negotiating process breaks out.
Speaking of input prices, Ariana, I mean, it's something that we have seen now for over a year. We've seen these escalating input prices when it comes to some of these key inputs that farmers are buying. But even now, they're telling me booking for fall, they're sick to their stomach when they're getting some of these pricing when it comes to fall fertilizer applications. So what have we learned in this whole process of COVID and the lingering impacts and this rise of input prices? What have we learned in all of this?
So I think there were some lessons in the 2008 recession that we actually didn't learn. We know that we are very reliant on importing fertilizers and inputs, and I think that has impacted agriculture. Farmers and non-land cost for farmers, meaning fertilizers and other inputs, have increased tremendously, and that's going to really impact how farmers are going to be profitable and what are the margins that they're going to perceive. But one of the things that I don't think we've learned that to be more self-reliant in terms of how do we feed and what are the inputs that our farmers need. We haven't been very, I don't think we have learned the lessons from COVID in 2008 about how is the food supply chain being structured and who is taking those margins from the farm gate, the farms put their crops outside, to the consumers who's going to end. Who is actually taking that weight when supply chain disrupts?
Jim, talking to some farmers in some areas where the crops are good, farm income levels this year could still be pretty decent despite those input prices. But when you look at the Ag Economy Barometer that you help author every month, how do sentiments and even perception, how does that compare to the reality?
Well, people are very concerned, and that's being reflected in the sentiment measures. The sentiment is down dramatically compared to where it was roughly a year and a half ago. And I think that's largely a reflection of the uncertainty that's out there. I think people in agriculture are acclimated to volatility in output prices, but what they're not acclimated to is the tremendous volatility we've been seeing in input prices and also the levels of those input prices. And I think that's created a tremendous amount of unease out there. So despite the fact that 2022 for most people is going to be a pretty good year, not as good as 21, but still a pretty good year, they're very, very uneasy about where they're headed and where their farming operation is headed. It's reflected in the sentiment. So that's can continue to be a concern.
Yeah, and Todd, when you look at some of these farm income forecasts, where could we see actually this year maybe be better than 2021, and what areas then are you also concerned about?
So I always look at the USDA forecast, and I've studied that one quite a bit, and they just released the most recent farm income forecast, updated their February forecast. It's up about 30%, so they're much more optimistic. But historically, they tend to kind of over-project in the summer, and they'll kind of ratchet it back down in the fall. So I don't think they're quite as rosy and optimistic as it appears. I don't think they will be as rosy and optimistic as it appears now. I think the cost side is what matters. We talked about input. The other one we haven't talked about is labor, and that's a real challenge across the economy, particularly in rural areas, particularly in the farm sector. Access to quality labor. So it's still too early to tell, even for this year. So it's tricky.
Yeah, when you look at some of those concerns both inside and outside of agriculture, and you think about China, Ariana, I mean, you look at some of the issues from the zero COVID, kind of that lockdown policy and the lingering effects. What are some things that maybe you want to know more out of China, and what are some of those trends that you're watching that could stick longer term?
So one of the issues or the things that has been talked a lot is what are the grain stocks that China may have, and how are those going to be released? What is the transparency that China may have to release those grain stocks or oil? Oil, we know that prices of oil was the highest increase, 60% prices since February of this year due to the Russian and Ukraine conflict. So when those issues of Russia and Ukraine, the conflict hasn't fixed, we need to rely on stocks that are, have been stored in other countries such as China. So we need to understand how are we going to feed the population, 8 billion people in the world, when the biggest storage needs to start to release those crops, because there's going to be a lag in production, a lag in infrastructure in Ukraine. So we need to understand how are we going to keep that supply of food, grains, cereals to the world and to wherever is needed.
All right, well, thank you all for being here. We really appreciate the insight. All right, we need to take a quick break and then we'll dive into more research that's happening right here at Purdue.